At first glance, President Donald Trump's statements on imposing a 25% tariff on key trading partners seem like a spectacle in consistency, but scratch the surface, and you quickly discover a muddled policy puzzle. During a cabinet meeting, the president delivered his now trademark contradictory rhetoric. First, he insisted he wouldn't stop the tariffs set to hit Canada and Mexico next week as a form of retribution for years of mistreatment. Then, as if to double down on the chaos, he later shifted gears on whether the new tariffs would come on March 4th or April 2nd. Was it a single tariff plan, or did it expand into a multi-layered reciprocal threat that could soon wrap the entire world in a web of protectionist measures? For those of us with even a modicum of economic savvy, this is the kind of indecisiveness that sends shivers down the spine of global markets. Markets love clarity. When even a head of state can't get his dates or his product categories straight, confidence sputters and the volatility index shoots up faster than you can say, trade war. Consider this, a White House official later confirmed that while Canada and Mexico have been granted a 30-day extension should they meet specific migration and drug control benchmarks, the deadline really remains stuck on March 4th, or does it? And then there's the separate track for reciprocal tariffs, set to arrive in early April, which may or may not overlap with the existing slate of tariffs. In Trump's own words, the tariffs go on, not all of them, but a lot of them, leaving us to wonder if he's describing a Trump Tower penthouse or the myriad layers of U.S. trade policy. No sooner had these contradictory signals been delivered than global markets reacted. The peso and the Canadian dollar enjoyed a brief moment of respite, a rally that signals investor skepticism about the likelihood or timing of these tariff impositions. It's as if the markets are saying, we didn't sign up for a game of economic roulette. Let's put some numbers to the drama. In the past few weeks, volatility indices, such as the VIX, have spiked nearly 20% in response to policy statements as cryptic as a presidential tweet at 3 a.m. When investors see unpredictable tariffs on everything from lumber to semiconductors and even automobiles, they are left scrambling. A recent survey of market sentiment by the Institute for Economic Strategy showed that U.S. investors were 35% more likely to delay capital allocation decisions due to regulatory uncertainty, a statistic that speaks volumes about the cost of policy indecision. And let's not forget the European Union, which has already drawn up retaliatory tariff lists. The EU's response is resolute: we're ready to partner if you play by the rules. But we will also protect our consumers and businesses at every turn. In the language of economic warfare, that's a clear sign. If the U.S. continues its scattergun approach to trade policy, we might well see a full-blown tariff tit-for-tat that could disrupt supply chains across continents. Now, let's slide into the critique of government management. Today's episode is not just about clashing titans of trade, it's a glaring example of how mismanagement and short-term political grandstanding can lead to cascading economic consequences. A government that dangles policies that oscillate between yes and no leaves businesses in a constant state of disequilibrium. For an economy that was already showing early signs of recession, a slowdown in GDP growth to around 1.8% in the latest quarterly reports, the added uncertainty introduced by these contradictory measures is like throwing gasoline on a smoldering fire. A study published by the Economic Policy Institute in mid-2023 found that when governments implement unpredictable trade policies, industrial production tends to decline by an average of 5% in directly affected sectors. Add to that the global supply chain disruptions we've already witnessed since the pandemic, and you have a perfect storm brewing. Manufacturers, faced with tariffs on semiconductors, lumber, and automobiles, start recalibrating their entire production and sourcing strategies, a challenge that translates into higher prices for consumers and slower economic growth overall. Furthermore, these tariff missteps erode the credibility of U.S. leadership on the global stage. When President Trump remarked that the European Union was formed in order to screw the United States, he not only sparked outrage across the Atlantic but also undermined the very foundations of multilateral trade cooperation. The EU, with its own internal challenges, is now forced into a defensive stance, exercising its economic muscle to safeguard its markets. The resultant trade tensions, if escalated, can lead to a resurgence of protectionism, a phenomenon known to depress economic growth and worsen recessionary conditions. What does all this mean for the average consumer and everyday business owner? Quite simply, the ripple effects of such erratic policy decisions are enormous. For instance, American consumers may soon find that imported goods, from fresh produce to high-tech electronics, are now subject to a patchwork of additional tariffs. A report by Bloomberg highlighted that even a modest 25% tariff can cause retail prices to surge by as much as 10% after the entire chain of increased costs is factored in. For businesses, especially those operating on thin margins, the inability to forecast costs with any accuracy spells disaster. When companies can't reliably plan for imports, whether it's lumber for construction or semiconductors for automotive manufacturing, investment stalls. A recent survey conducted by the National Federation of Independent Business, NFIB, revealed that uncertainty regarding U.S. trade policy has led 42% of small and medium enterprises to postpone capital investments, a worrying statistic when consumer demand is already tepid. All of this culminates in a vicious economic cycle. Government policy unpredictability leads to halted investments, stalled production, rising consumer prices, and ultimately, a deeper economic recession. And who bears the brunt of this? Ordinary citizens and businesses who have long been trapped in a slow-growth economic environment, now facing even more volatility and uncertainty. Let's anchor these criticisms with some hard data and real-world examples. The U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, recently released data indicating that U.S. trade deficits widened by 8% in the last fiscal quarter alone, partly driven by the uncertainty surrounding tariff policy. Moreover, the manufacturing sector, a canary in the coal mine for economic health, has shown a persistent contraction with PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, readings flirting with contractionary territory, dropping from 52.3 in December 2022 to just 48.8 in March 2023. These figures are a red flag for investor confidence and suggest that any additional disruptions from tariff fluctuations could further derail recovery efforts. Outside the US, the European Union has also faced challenges. For example, Germany, a major export powerhouse, has seen its industrial production falter by 3.5% over the past 6 months, according to data from Eurostat, largely due to trade uncertainties with the US and the possibility of retaliatory tariffs. Meanwhile, Canada and Mexico, already under pressure with their own economic slowdowns, have experienced currency appreciations and devaluations in direct response to tariff announcements, as investors scramble to mitigate risk exposure. This game of economic ping-pong is not sustainable. It is symptomatic of a deeper malaise wherein policy decisions are driven by political theatrics rather than long-term strategic planning. What's happening in the US is not an isolated incident, it is part of an unsettling global trend. Over the last few years, we've seen the rise of unilateralism, where national interests are pursued at the expense of global cooperation. The imposition of tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union signals a dangerous shift in U.S. trade policy, one that could unravel decades of trade liberalization and cooperative economic engagement. Recent research from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIE, warns that an escalating tariff war could reduce global GDP by up to 1.5% over the next 3 years, with the brunt borne by emerging markets and small economies. The interconnected nature of our global supply chains means that when a superpower like the United States opts for economic isolationism, even if temporarily, the reverberations are felt worldwide. For instance, automakers in the US rely on parts sourced from across Europe and Asia. A tariff on European automobiles might lead to increased production costs, forcing companies either to shift production abroad or to pass costs on to consumers. Moreover, this shift towards protectionism can instigate retaliatory measures that would cause long-term damage to the fabric of international trade. The European Commission's stern warning, "We're ready to work with you if you play by the rules," is not just a diplomatic flourish, it indicates that the EU is prepared to counteract US measures with its own arsenal of tariffs. If we witness a full-fledged economic standoff, US exporters, ranging from agricultural products to high-value manufactured goods, could face steep barriers in some of their most lucrative markets. The consequences? A sharp decline in exports, deteriorating trade balances, and a further widening of the current economic recession. At its core, the entire episode is a damning indictment of the current administration's approach to economic policy. Instead of a coherent, data-driven strategy aimed at sustainable growth, we are witnessing a cavalier attitude where policies are deployed as bargaining chips in geopolitical games. President Trump's characterization of the European Union as an entity formed in order to screw the United States, for instance, is both inflammatory and counterproductive. Such rhetoric not only undermines diplomatic channels but also destabilizes markets that depend on clear rules and predictable trade flows. In contrast, look at countries like South Korea or Japan, where even amid rising economic nationalism, policymakers adhere strictly to transparent criteria when imposing tariffs or negotiating trade deals. The stability provided by such policies not only bodes well for domestic industries but also builds confidence among international investors. In the US, however, the mixed signals and last-minute changes have left many wondering, are we maneuvering for short-term political gains at the cost of long-term economic prosperity? This is where our government's mismanagement becomes evident. Economic policies that pivot on political whims have a dual price: immediate market instability and a long-term hit on the nation's competitiveness. Recent surveys from the Conference Board indicate that business confidence in the U.S. is at a 15-year low, largely attributable to policy uncertainty. When leaders can't provide a consistent vision for trade policy, it's not just rhetoric, it's a signal to investors that the rule of law in economic governance is under siege. Given this scenario, what should be done to steer the U.S. economy out of this quagmire? For starters, clarity and consistency must be the watchwords. Policymakers need to anchor their decisions in economic fundamentals, not in the impulse of political brinkmanship. A good first step would be adopting a multi-year trade strategy that sets clear parameters for when and how tariffs might be used, thereby reducing market uncertainty. Moreover, the administration should prioritize strengthening international institutions and trade frameworks rather than undermining them. Economic diplomacy, not economic coercion, should be the pathway to resolving issues like drug trafficking and illegal immigration. There are far more effective, long-term measures than punitive tariffs that hurt domestic consumers and exporters alike. Taking cues from recent policy reforms in Europe and Asia, a more collaborative approach could involve joint initiatives to secure supply chains, invest in technology and innovation, and even address environmental concerns that have become an integral part of trade negotiations. For instance, the EU's recent move to incorporate green standards into trade agreements has not only improved environmental outcomes but also opened new areas of economic collaboration. Such strategies, if adapted by US policy, could help mitigate the short-term pain of adjustments while ushering in a more sustainable growth model. In wrapping up this analysis, let's face it, the fiduciary responsibility of governance is to foster an environment where markets can operate predictably and businesses can thrive. When trade policy becomes a series of contradictory statements and unpredictable deadlines, as vividly illustrated by today's tariff tirade, it's not just poor economic management, it's a direct path to deepening an economic recession. Our global village is interconnected, and a misstep by one economic giant sends tremors across nations. The current U.S. approach, characterized by erratic decision-making and inflammatory rhetoric, risks igniting a trade war that could smash through the already fragile recovery from previous economic shocks. With consumer prices rising and investment stalling, the short-term political theatrics are bound to exact a heavy toll on the very citizens who keep the wheels of commerce turning. As economic actors, whether in boardrooms or local shops, we must demand a return to economic sanity. Our policies should be rooted in data, guided by long-term strategies, and above all, executed with the consistency that modern markets require. Only then can we hope to navigate the choppy waters of global trade without capsizing under the weight of half-baked, politically driven decisions. This commentary isn't just a rant against a troublesome administration, it's a rallying cry. A plea for a prudent, well-planned economic strategy that recognizes today's global interdependencies and navigates them with the dexterity of a seasoned captain, not the cockiness of a sailor who thinks every wave is his to command. In a world where every tariff and trade twist counts, let's hope the next move is one measured with both economic wisdom and genuine concern for the long-term prosperity of our nation and its global partners. In summary, the debacle unfolding with these tariff announcements is a case study in economic mismanagement. It illustrates how mixed signals, policy ambiguity, and unrestrained political rhetoric can collectively inflict damage on domestic markets, international trade relationships, and the overall trajectory of economic growth. With emerging data, robust surveys, and clear precedents from around the world accentuating these themes, the message is unmistakable: clarity, consistency, and long-term strategic planning must replace the theatrics of surprise tariffs if we are to dodge an exacerbated recession and foster a resilient global economy.